Hello. Okay, Facebook's up, YouTube's up. Hello and welcome to the 8:30 Live. Now, this is my first time doing it from the Facebook page, so please bear with me for a second because for the last month or so, I've been doing Facebook Lives every night at 8:30 from my personal page. They've been going over quite well. We talk about the news of the day, politics, getting some really deep conversations. It's been wonderful. And today I thought I'd do it from the Facebook page and see how that goes. See if other folks want to tune in. But bear with me for a second while I share this now to my regular Facebook profile because people like that. People want to tune in. So just 1 second. Then we'll get to sort of the normal news of the day. Oh, I can't share it to my profile from... This is a nuisance. Oh, Facebook, why do you do the things you do? Which I guess brings us to the first topic of the day, why Facebook does the things it does and what Donald Trump is trying to do to stop them. So I don't know if folks heard, but Donald Trump issued an executive order today regarding social media platforms. This all started yesterday when Twitter decided to put a warning on one of Donald Trump's tweets regarding vote by mail. Donald Trump said that vote by mail would lead to massive voter fraud, and instead, or rather in response, Twitter flagged his tweet and decided to say that this is incorrect and we're fact checking it now. Now, this created a whole firestorm because Donald Trump immediately came out and said that there is obvious political bias on the social media platforms, that this shouldn't be the case, and he was going to do something about it to guarantee free speech to all Americans. Now, Mark Zuckerberg came out today and he said that social media platforms should not be in the business of being arbiters of truth. And we've spoken about arbiters of truth several times on the 8:30 Live. And ultimately, that's a load of hooey. Mark Zuckerberg definitely thinks that social media platforms should be the arbiter of truth. He just doesn't want to give up political ad money. You know this because Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook platform has already been going around fact-checking articles and telling people that their content needs to be removed or its circulation will be reduced because it's true or partially false or completely false. And I know because this happened to me when I tried to share an article, explain the context of the article, and because the article that I had shared had factual misrepresentation or errors that Facebook decided to flag, it flagged my post explaining that article as partially false. So we already know that Facebook's out there trying to be an arbiter of truth or stepping in as an arbiter of truth. So first, Mark Zuckerberg's statement that social media platforms should just take a step out of the political arena and not be fact-checking is completely counter Facebook's current policy. We also spoke yesterday about YouTube doing censorship, so you can check that video out. It's shared to the page. But ultimately, this all comes down to what Donald Trump did today. In response to Twitter flagging his tweet as misinformation, he immediately, within 24 hours, wrote an executive order and signed an executive order basically calling on the FTC to regulate social media platforms. Now, I'm going to pull up the executive order because I read through the actual text of it. And really, you might wonder what is so bad about this thing. It seems to be fairly curtailed in its ambition. Well, let's talk about how the internet works, one of the most important foundational elements of the internet, and what Trump's executive order really does. So the first thing to understand is Section 230 of the FTC code, particularly Section C, subsection C. And what Section 230 does is it's the hold harmless provision. Now, this provision basically says that if you're not making any editorial decisions on your platform, then you are not responsible for any content generated by users. So this is really important to social media platforms, but you can just imagine at any, in any given space on the internet, you have people who might have the capacity to upload content. And this means that anybody hosting that content is not responsible. It's not just for social media platforms. It also applies to, internet service providers or internet hosters. So if you're a host service and somebody decides to make a website that is conducting illegal activity, just because you're giving them space on the internet doesn't mean that you're responsible for what that person produces. Likewise, if you are hosting a forum on the internet, as long as you're not picking and choosing who gets to speak based on your personal preferences, that is to say, you're not editorializing, then you are held harmless and you're not responsible for anything those people post. So, for example, 4chan then, which is well known, or really it's been shut down, but I guess now 8chan, because these forums do no editorializing, they don't pick and choose what content goes up, people can go there and post whatever they want, the most heinous things, but 4chan or 8chan is not responsible for what those people post. So how do we get into the situation where there's moderated content? Well, Section 230 does provide for moderation to be done against lascivious or abusive or offensive content. And this is left up to the not the social media platforms, but to the platforms of the internet. Again, not just social media, also hosting. So like Amazon EC2, which is their cloud service, they're not responsible for the websites that are hosted on their servers. What Section 230 does is it allows them the capacity to remove things that are offensive, lascivious, abusive, and a couple of other words that they threw in there, but they all mean the same thing, which is if something is really, really bad, you have the right to remove it or make rules against it, so long as it's done in, quote, good faith. And this is what Donald Trump is really going after. He's saying that the social media platforms in particular are moving away from becoming open forums to exercising editorial control. So they then move out of the realm of an open forum into the realm of being a publisher. And publishers are absolutely constrained by certain laws. So for example, defamation suits can't be brought against social media platforms because, again, they have no editorial control. They're not expressing their own viewpoint. So you can't sue them for defamation when somebody posts something that may or may not be defaming on their platform. However, the New York Times exercises editorial control, even in the op-ed section where people submit content. As long as the New York Times chooses to publish that content, and this goes for any other news outlet, as long as they choose to publish that content, they, as an institution, can be held accountable for defamation. So what does this executive order do? Well, it opens up with a pretty long-winded explanation of how in favor of free speech Donald Trump is and how important free speech is to the internet. Now, I just want to take a slight tangent here and say that in this part of the document, the White House calls out several court cases which affirm the idea that social media platforms are, in fact, an important element of the modern public square and can be very important to the exercising of free speech, and calls on these platforms to adhere to these legal interpretations. I just want to call on Donald Trump. Donald Trump has banned many people. He's blocked many people on Twitter. And now that the White House has decided that social media platforms are a place for free speech and debate, I'm wondering, will Donald Trump finally obey the court order requiring him to unblock people so that they can converse and communicate with their elected official? Well, we'll see. That hasn't happened yet, but just everything Donald Trump does is it all drips with irony, completely unacknowledged by the administration. The hypocrisy is so deep. In any event, the meat and potatoes of the executive order really start in Section 3, really start in Section 2, where the president titled Protections Against Online Censorship. And this is where he starts to talk about what he would like the FTC to do. And the first thing he calls on the FTC to do is, he calls on the Attorney General to go to the FTC and request clarification on Section 230. So basically, this hold harmless clause has been left to be interpreted very, very broadly, admittedly, and he's calling on clarification of what constitutes and what does not constitute editorializing, right? So we were just talking about the whole rationale for Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, HostGator, all these platforms on the internet. They're not responsible for the content that's on their services because they exercise no editorial content. Therefore, they're held harmless. Okay, so they are given the opportunity, again, to provide censorship so long as it's done in good faith. So Donald Trump is calling on clarification rulemaking from the FTC as to what constitutes good faith, what constitutes obscene or lascivious or abusive behavior. And then he's asking for a report to be generated by the Attorney General and the Department of Justice as to whether or not these platforms are truly operating within the bounds of Section 230. Now, I think it's important to understand that right now there is no real clarity on this. And so, of course, they are operating within the bounds because there have been no bounds set. The FTC is a bipartisan entity, which is to say that there is a limit to how many members can be of a single party. But the president does nominate the folks who sit on it. So it's unclear where the FTC will end up going, but we can certainly say that Arjit Pai, who's the chairman, was called out massively at the beginning of this administration's term for moving on net neutrality, for trying to eliminate net neutrality, which ultimately did happen by vote of the FTC. So, regardless, that's Section 1, calling on rulemaking clarification for the limits on Section 230, which provides these platforms with their immunity from any sort of responsibility regarding content on their platforms. Basically saying, how can I get these folks classified as publishers? The second component of this is Section 3, protecting federal taxpayer dollars from financing online platforms that restrict free speech. And what this is, I mean, Donald Trump really is using the power at his disposal to threaten corporations to do his bidding. Because what this does is it basically says, now that we're going to get some restrictions from the FTC on what constitutes hold harmless under Section 230, now I want every single agency and department to look at where they spend their ad dollars and produce a report within 30 days of how much money you're spending on online advertising and to which platforms it's going. And then the threat being that we're going to start withholding money, or we're going to start divesting from advertising on platforms that we deem to be in violation of free speech. There's a lot of money that the government spends online, and ultimately this could end up with some serious repercussions, not just for these platforms and the money they receive from the federal government, not just for the federal government and its operations, but also for residents of the United States, because so much information is shared and propagated through social media that removing the government's capacity to, say, advertise things like fill out your census form on Facebook really diminishes its capacity to purvey really important social content. And what do you call those things? Not public announcements, public service announcements, PSAs, right? So it's bad on so many levels that the government would try and pick and choose distribution channels, knowing that those distribution channels are very, very heavily used by the general public. But again, it all comes down to how the government, how the administration is going to try and define whether or not these platforms are worthy of receiving this ad revenue. Okay. The Department of Justice is in theory going to do this this analysis and then determine whether or not these platforms are discriminating against people. So perhaps the biggest issue here is that this is all wrapped up within an agency. So most of the power is wrapped up within an agency we know does the president's bidding. We're talking about the Department of Justice. Their reports are going to fall very much in line with what the White House wants, because as we know from its prosecution of folks like Michael Flynn, it's absolutely ready to go above and beyond traditional boundaries to ensure that the president's will is exercised. Okay, so Section 4, Federal Review of Unfair or Deceptive Acts or Practices. This part is really talking about, so surprise, surprise, the White House created a form for people to complain about whether or not they received bias on the internet. And over 16,000 people filled this out, I think within like the first 3 months. And well, let's see. Actually, it doesn't give the time frame, but 16,000 people or so have filed complaints with the White House saying that they've been persecuted by social media platforms for their political points of view. So what this would require, this section requires, is the White House is going to transmit all of those complaints to the FTC, and the FTC then is going to have to investigate them. And it's going to have to open up its own framework and own portal to allow people to complain and file complaints against social media platforms for political bias. And then Section 5, and this is the big one that a lot of people are concerned about, and I've seen it misinterpreted, so I think this is the most important piece to go over. State review of unfair, deceptive acts or practices and anti-discrimination laws. Okay, so this one has the Attorney General establish a working group regarding potential actual law enforcement and creation of new laws for states to adopt that would restrict or bind the social media platforms, preventing them from, doing this discriminatory editorial decisions on their platforms, and then allow for their prosecution. Most importantly, and this is the part that gets misconstrued on the internet, at least as I've seen, this working group shall invite state attorneys. Mind you, they don't have to participate. So this could be just a working group of state attorneys from Republican states, because it's completely unspecified whether states need to be represented or which states shall be represented. It's just that the Attorney General may invite them. Well, shall invite state attorneys general. Actually, I take it back. Because it has the word shall, it actually does say that the working group must invite, and because it says state attorneys general without any clarification, actually, that would imply that it shall invite every single state attorney general. Okay, I take that back, but it shall invite a state attorney general for discussion and consultation as appropriate and consistent with applicable law, and complaints described in Section 4B, which is that section regarding the complaints that were brought to the White House, the 16,000 complaints that were brought to the White House. Complaints described in Section 4B of this order will be shared with the working group, right? So all the White House complaints about, I was discriminated against on the internet for my political beliefs, those will be given to the working group. And the working group shall also collect publicly available information regarding the following. 1, increased scrutiny of users based on the other users they choose to follow or their interactions with other users. That's been a big sticking point. We'll get into that in a second. 2, algorithms to suppress content or users based on indications of political alignment or viewpoint. 3, differential policies allowing for otherwise impermissible behavior when committed by accounts associated with the Chinese Communist Party or other anti-democratic associations or governments. 4, reliance on third-party entities, including contractors, media organizations, and individuals with indicia of bias to review content. And 5, acts that limit the ability of users with particular viewpoints to earn money on the platform compared with other users similarly situated. Okay, now the big thing here, which people have been concerned about, is one, which is the increased scrutiny of users based on other users they choose to follow or their interactions with other users. And folks have taken that to mean, incorrectly, that this executive order is calling on the Department of Justice to exercise scrutiny of users based on who they follow and their interactions with other users. This is not the case. What the executive order says is that the DOJ, this working group convened by the DOJ of State's Attorney General, shall review public information about the extent to which social media platforms use that information. I mean, ultimately, a lot of these things into which the executive order calls for investigation aren't outlandish, right? This is pretty reasonable. The issue at hand is really who's going to be in charge of it. And again, we've seen that much of this power has been allocated to the Department of Justice, and the DOJ has been wielded, I think, pretty concretely, we can say, as a tool of the administration's political objectives. So, is there a problem with social media platforms being the arbiters of truth? We've spoken about this several times on the 830 Live, and I certainly believe the answer is yes. Is Donald Trump right to call that out? In some regard, I would say yes. Is this executive order absolutely bonkers? I don't think so, having read the text. But does it create a situation where the powers and directives within the executive order can be abused? Absolutely. And are the folks charged with executing this executive order, are these folks who are independent of the White House and can be trusted to do this in an unbiased way that doesn't threaten or cajole social media platforms to undertake a specific political agenda? No, I don't think so. I think Twitter handed Donald Trump exactly what he wanted, which was an opportunity to use the government's power to regulate and provide oversight for social media platforms going into November. Now we're going to have a working group. Now we're going to have an FTC. Now we're going to have a Department of Justice that is charged with looking at social media posts, and they are quite possibly going to start producing a litany of reports stating that our social media platforms are biased and that they are rigging the 2020 election. That is really, really dangerous. And it doesn't look like there's a really strong set of checks and balances or independence in the pursuit of any of these objectives. And so it's all really nice words, but as we know now, words are not good enough. It is also the people in charge. This is basically what we're finding out about the Constitution and the presidency. Words about how the president should behave, words about the constraints on the executive, all of these words are just ever so nice. It matters who has the power to execute on those words and whether or not they really take those words seriously. Because if they don't, you need to provide oversight of those people, and you need to be ready and willing and capable to take them to court and then have the courts decide in your favor. And as we know, the courts have been very, very rapidly stacked with Trump appointees in the federal courts. And we have a Supreme Court where some of the justices that have been appointed really love the idea of executive authority. So this executive order, while it doesn't really sound terrible, and I will admit addresses a really, really important problem, is still dangerous and not something that we should want to see coming out of this administration or any administration without really strong language on the independence of the people who are in charge of processing this executive order and mechanisms to hold those people accountable and ensure their independence. Okay, so that is the executive order, and we've spoken. If you want to look into some of the suggestions that we've made on the 8:30 Live as to how social media companies could better do their fact checking so that it is in fact more unbiased and is in fact something that is helpful to discourse, then please scroll back down to yesterday or 2 days ago. We discussed it both times, but this is a huge issue. Now let's do some comments on this before we get to the next item, because folks comment on these things, and that's why I love doing it. Dorian says, "Sup." Hey Dorian, what do you think about the mass looting in Minnesota? Yes, that will be our next topic. We'll get to that. But let's see. James King, it's not even clear this is constitutional, the executive order, let alone something the president can actually direct any independent office to do. Access to the Twitter, Facebook audience is not speech. Right. This is absolutely true. The private corporations that are Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Google, these are not entities that are responsible to the First Amendment, right? They have no responsibility or requirement to be platforms of free speech. However, as we mentioned at the beginning, they are bound under Section 230 of the, I forget what the, I think it's Title II of the Communications Code. Yeah, no, Title II is for net neutrality. Oh, well, I forget. I'll figure it out. I'll put it down there in the comments or something. But Section 230 of some code that the FTC propagated allows for internet platforms to be held harmless due to content posted on their platform. So again, this is not just social media websites. It also counts for servers and web hosters. And anytime somebody puts any content on the internet, as long as the platform to which they're uploading it, it could be a website, it could be a single post, doesn't matter. As long as the platform is agnostic to content and has no editorial control, then they fall under Section 230 and they can't be sued for defamation. They can't be held liable for the content that shows up. But the minute, and actually, James, you've sort of spoken to this with, we were talking about the AI that helps law enforcement remove pornographic material of children. As long as platforms exercise no editorial control, they're not responsible for the content that appears. But the minute they are found to exercise editorial control, then they become not platforms which are held harmless, but publishers, and then they can be sued for things like defamation, or they are directly responsible for the publishing of child pornography or of obscenities that appear on their services. So even though the First Amendment has nothing to do with this, really, Donald Trump can talk all he wants in the executive order and on Twitter about the importance of free speech, even though this isn't about the First Amendment. Donald Trump is asking whether or not he's directing the FTC to issue new regulations clarifying what Section 230 means and the line between a hold harmless platform and a publisher. So all of the rhetoric about the First Amendment, all of the rhetoric about free speech is just that, rhetoric. It has nothing to do with the actual nuts and bolts of how this executive order works. That all revolves around Section 230 and whether or not these platforms are going to be continue to be seen as neutral purveyors of content, or are going to be deemed editorial because they are selectively choosing a political position. And if they choose a political position, then they will be immediately opened up. Sorry, this is unclear. If they choose a political position and it's deemed that that removes your protections under Section 230, then they will be immediately exposing themselves to countless lawsuits over defamation, over posted obscenities, over hate crimes and racist materials put on their websites, over 1 million billion different things. And so it's an economic threat, not really a criminal threat, right? They're going to get sued in all of these civil cases. I guess maybe there could be some criminal cases. They could then be sued for, I guess, yeah, like if somebody posted child pornography, the platform is then sued for hosting the child pornography because as an editor, they should not have allowed it. Then they would be liable for criminal charges as well, right? So that's the threat. So I actually think this is entirely constitutional. It all depends on how Section 230 gets defined by the FTC. And we're going to have to just wait and see. And then there will probably be some lawsuits. The other way to get around this is for Congress to legislate. But of course, you know that the Senate Republicans are completely in Trump's pocket. Okay. So that handles the executive order, which was a pretty big thing. I think it's a big deal for sure. Again, this is something that's going to deeply impact the way that discourse happens in the United States leading up to November. And if anything, I am concerned that this will be a messaging coup for Trump as government reports put out, government agencies put out report after report about how social media is biased leading into 2020. James King, this is absolutely true. Any media platform can be treated as a publisher once they execute editorial control. The issue is that the same laws that govern Section 230 protections also assure that these platforms can create any kind of content filtering rules they want, so long as they don't infringe on protected classes. Political affiliation is not a protected class. That is, I'm going to dispute that second half of that, which is that Section 230 gives them the capacity to remove or moderate content in good faith that is agnostic to the content and is just and is deemed detrimental to the community. So again, obscene, racist, hateful, pornographic material. These are rubrics which are agnostic to the person and the political views. And so that is why Donald Trump is asking for clarification on Section 230 from the FTC, because I don't think that the actual law, or I'm not even sure, I should look into this, I'll have to look into this for tomorrow, whether or not this is actually a law that was passed by Congress or whether it was law created through regulation by the FTC. But I don't think it's actually about protected classes. I think it really is about the agnostic application of a set of rules, and that the question is, if you start deciding that misinformation is a violation of terms of service, and then determining for yourself what misinformation is, and misinformation has obviously become a political question now, then you're exercising editorial control as to what people should be able to see or not see. So I don't know if it is about protected classes in this case. I think there might really be grounds constitutionally for this executive order, but I'll tell you what, I'll look into it for tomorrow. Now, to Dorian's point, or question I should say, what do you think about the mass looting in Minnesota? This is definitely on the agenda for today, and it's big. Actually, there are two more big things. One is about the situation in Minnesota, which we've discussed yesterday. We also discussed the park incident, the Central Park incident with Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, unrelated. And then the other thing we want to talk about today is rent. There's a rent relief package working its way through Albany, which is absolutely terrible. So let's talk about why we have terrible rent relief. But let's talk, okay, so Minnesota. Here's the deal as far as I'm concerned with Minnesota. What happened there is absolutely egregious. There was just murder on the street by police officers who are meant to serve and protect the populace for really nothing. There was no violence. There was no threat of violence. George Floyd was arrested and killed for maybe having a forged $20 bill. Unclear that it was his $20 bill. There was no trial, obviously. So there is righteous outrage about this. Now, we spoke yesterday about the protest that precipitated the riots. Thousands of people gathered where George Floyd was killed, and they had a very peaceful protest. A minority of that group marched over to the 3rd precinct, and then a smaller contingent of that group yet vandalized the police station, breaking a window, and vandalized police cars. This then, after the live, devolved into a real, I guess you'd say, riot. Well, not riot, but protest. Riot implies that there's no purpose for it, that people were just angry and going crazy. This was a protest that ended up in the destruction of property and with looting. So, ultimately, I don't really believe that looting or rioting, which is to say violent protesting, gets us very far. I don't think it achieves any aims. When people talk about the Minneapolis situation and how folks were tear gassed there, and then they talk about the open carry reopen movements, which were all just white folks in like Michigan. When people talk about these things, they compare them, and they compare the police treatment of one group to another, which is to say black folk who are protesting law enforcement wantonly killing them get tear gassed, and then white folks showing up with assault rifles get nothing. Like literally, police allow these folks to yell in their faces. That argument becomes so much harder to make the minute that there's any sort of property damage or violence. Why? Because even though thousands of people gathered peacefully, the media and all the memes and the messaging on the right then become, look at these crazy, violent people setting fire to their own homes. Of course they have to be tear gassed. It is, I think, counterproductive to the cause of advancing justice. Now, I remember I wrote, I'm going to begin with this. All right. 3 years ago or so, I attended a Black Lives Matter meeting deep in Brooklyn with Hawk Newsom, great guy, who's one of the heads of Black Lives Matter here. And at that meeting, we were all given handouts of the principles of Kingian nonviolence. It was the first meeting of Black Lives Matter in New York. Okay, first chapter. We were all given handouts of Kingian principles of nonviolence, and I read them, and I still have them over on my desk, although you can just look them up on the internet, so I highly encourage you to do so. And my favorite quote from Dr. King is, this is the one that I find most instructive of all of the things he said. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And when we allow ourselves to be violent, we undermine the principal idea of nonviolence. That is, it is nonviolence and love and compassion. And yes, the contrast of violence to nonviolence, of being the subject of violence, but not the perpetrator of violence, that optic, these are our most powerful weapons in the nonviolence movement. Now, I understand that there are folks who, I saw a post about this today, talking about these protests in Minneapolis, not as protests, not as riots, but as rebellion. And I think that is pretty dangerous. That also doesn't serve the purposes of justice, because to say that this is rebellion, one, it does two, I think, pretty big things. One, whether or not you want to view this as against the government, you can have protests against the government, you can have protests against prevailing power structures, and they're not rebellions. Rebellions imply violence, and they imply overthrow, and they imply that you're traitorous to the United States of America. This is really dangerous for a couple of reasons. One, because it removes sympathy. You lose the sympathy of large classes of people who aren't involved in your protest when you start talking about insurrection and rebellion. And two, you're going to draw the attention of the government, and the penalties for insurrection or rebellion are much, much higher than the penalties for protest. The penalty for insurrection or rebellion is death. Like, that's, It's treason. And ultimately, the United States, is a democracy, and there are a lot of things still left on the table for us to do to move things forward. And I don't want people to think that this is somehow anti-reactionary, because we have already moved the ball forward in many, many ways. The police, now, a lot of people have given their lives. We've seen a lot of people who have died to move the ball forward. But I think it is important to acknowledge that the ball has moved forward. The police who killed George Floyd were immediately fired. That's not something that would have happened just a year ago. The mayor of Minneapolis publicly questioned, why aren't these police officers in jail for murder? That's not something that would have happened a year ago. And I'm not saying that theoretically. I'm saying that because a year ago, there was another person there were many people who died, and those police officers were not fired, and nobody questioned why those police weren't in jail for murder. In fact, let's go back I think it was almost 3 or 4 years ago now, Falando Castille, same area. You might remember him. He was the guy who was pulled over by a police officer, had a license for a firearm, had a gun, but again, had a license and was pulled over. And when the police officer saw that he had a firearm, just shot him to death, right? Now, there was some interaction, but absolutely nothing violent, just shot this guy. That triggered, a huge outcry, and the police department went to bat for this guy. We're not seeing the same thing here. We've come a distance. It's unfortunately cost lives, but rebellion costs lives too, just in a different way. In fact, it generally costs more lives. The really, really critical thing here is to see what happens with the justice system. Now, the mayor questioned why these police officers weren't in jail for murder, because the mayor doesn't have discretion over this. The Hennepin County Attorney General does. The Hennepin County Attorney General is the person who's going to have to decide whether or not to prosecute any or all of the 4 police officers who were involved in this. They're going to have to decide, if they choose to prosecute, how aggressively to prosecute. And they're going to have to decide, if they prosecute, what sentence they're going to ask. Life in prison, they're going to prosecute it as murder in the first, murder in the second. They're going to decide who gets prosecuted in what way as well. So, the Hennepin County attorney is elected. That's an elected role. If they don't act on this, it is much easier and safer, and probably, I would argue, more effective to run somebody against that attorney and win that election. Now, I understand, of course, there are structures in this country that prevent minorities and oppressed people from being heard fairly in the political process. Voter suppression, poverty, simple lack of education, money in politics. There are 1,000,001 ways that people are disenfranchised in this country. Still, I have always been somebody who believes in the power of organizing and participation in peaceful civic engagement. I mean, that's basically the vast majority of how I've spent the last 10 years, and I teach workshops on this. I don't think that faith is misplaced. And as a result, I don't believe that looting is the right course of action. I believe that organizing is the right course of action. I believe protesting is the right course of action. I believe registering people to vote is the right course of action. I believe that talking to your neighbors is the right course of action. Now, is it a huge, huge problem that people went looting? Does that delegitimize their frustration? Does it delegitimize what came before? Does it somehow make what these police officers did okay? Absolutely not. As far as I'm concerned, this looting is just one step towards the healing process. And it's unfortunate that some property had to be destroyed, but it doesn't look like anybody was hurt. Nobody was killed. And at the end of the day, that's a far cry from what instigated the protests. What instigated the protests was somebody was taken off the street for no reason. Somebody who was non-threatening was put down by the police officers, and police officers are currently getting away with what I would call murder. The looting, the destruction of property that came about as a reaction is not something that advances the cause. I don't think it's useful. It would be better if it didn't happen. It is not on the scale of the actual crime that was committed, which led to the looting. So that's sort of how I view it. I do think, though, that beyond not being in the right direction, it is counterproductive for all the reasons that I had mentioned before, and it is certainly against the principles of kinging and nonviolence. And if we're going to pursue a nonviolent resolution to this, listen, there is, there's black separatist movements. There's Boogaloo. We've talked about Boogaloo before the Second Civil War. There are people who are pro-Boogaloo who are now debating whether or not they should be coming. And mostly we associate Boogaloo with like the militia movement and white supremacy and all that stuff. There are folks in the Boogaloo movement who are like, is this the moment to come to the aid of our black brothers and sisters and fight for an overthrow of the U.S. government? That exists. Malcolm X talking about, these sorts of things. At the end of the day, it looks like people want to move forward with a democratic, system and want what we generally consider the United States to continue to exist. And if that's the path we're going down, then we should use to our fullest capacity the structures which give us, the people, power over our police departments, over our elected officials, over our state prosecutors. So, that's really what I think. And if this were a different time, if there weren't a pandemic, I would probably head out to Minneapolis for a bit. I went after Ferguson, after Michael Brown was shot. I did head out to St. Louis, and I took some lay of the land there. Spoke to some organizers there. I was vice president of the Young Democrats of America at the time. YDA held its conference in St. Louis, one of its conferences in St. Louis that year. So, I wish we could be on the ground organizing. I really think that it's just such a powerful and important thing to do, and it's a real shame we can't. But actually, if there's any way for me to connect with folks out there virtually, if anybody knows of anybody who would be good to connect with, I'm certainly happy to do so, since I can't get there in person and start poking around. But ultimately, I believe that there are probably really great organizers out there. I know people who live in Minneapolis who are politically engaged and who are organizers, and I really do hope that the Hennepin County Attorney does their job, and that if they don't, there is a massive, massive move to replace that person, and that election is won. Let's see if there's any more comments here. Yes, James. This is why I spend so much time fighting with all the angry ANCAP tanky LARPers. I don't know what those things are. Can you clarify? In my internet circles, who co-opted the language of revolution to justify violence against anyone. Ooh, this is longer when I hit the button. Who co-opted the language of revolution to justify violence against anyone who disagrees with their tactics or aims. It's an incredibly short-sighted and worthless set of positions that only hurts the prospects of people actually engaged in peaceful coalition building, i.e. real politics. The most annoying part is that building and executing successful protest movements is hard and thankless, which is all undermined by tiny squads of morons who want to take their pound of flesh directly from the communities they claim to be trying to help. Yes, and actually I'll speak a little bit more to one of the points that I think that's embedded in there, which is that coalition building and, quote, real politics is hard. It is very difficult. It is mostly thankless and under the radar, and you don't get glory from it. I think a lot of what's fueling the Boogaloo movements, the Civil War movements, the militia movements, the violence movements, is the idea that people want to be recognized and acknowledged. And this is actually, if you've ever read Freakonomics, there's actually an interesting point on this, that the tumult of the 60s, you could say that, Vietnam, Cold War, there's like a million things that you could point to and say, this was a tumultuous time, and it resulted in a 70s and 80s that were just the decay of society. But Freakonomics ties it to the population boom that happened, not the baby boom. Oh, well, it ties it first to the baby boom, but there was a population boom in many places around the world that lasted for 2 generations or 3 generations after World War II, because everybody came back. There was a smaller population. Everybody got down to business. They had kids, and then those kids went and had bigger families, and they were more affluent than their parents, so they could have more children, and they did more things and demanded more from the economy. And you ended up with a generation or two of children who entered the workforce and just oversupplied the economy with labor. And as a result, a lot of these people, a lot of these kids in the 70s and late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, they simply, looking for something to do and a purpose for their lives, fell into all of these various movements, hippie movements, or they joined gangs or whatever it was, right? And so, to some extent, this is a theory. Certainly, it's a hypothesis. It's not been tested in any way. I couldn't even call it a theory, really. But there's maybe a fact that, there's maybe an impulse, rather, I should say, that given social media, given the fact that everything seems to be centered around content creation and influencers and getting your 15 minutes of fame, that it's become significantly more ingrained in people's psyche that recognition is more important than doing the work. This is, of course, always been the case. We've always known, particularly those of us who do organizing, that there are sets of folks who care more about recognition than about doing the work. It has always been that way. But now, the hypertension of the body politic, given the polarization, given the fact that violence does get attention, that maybe some of what we're seeing is the result of a culture that's completely invested in vapidity and momentary attention rather than the deep necessity of doing work. Who knows? That's just a theory that I put out there, or just a hypothesis I put out there. Now we're going to get to some of these comments, and we've got a new commenter. So let's go down, and one thing from James. From James, some definitions to the questions I asked. 1, tanky equals Maoist or Stalin apologist. It's a reference to the USSR Chinese imperialism of the late 40s onward, i.e. send in the tanks when the country that resists your political aims resists. Okay, thank you very much. And Julianne Ballington says, do you grant that people were treated differently in Michigan and what happened in Minneapolis? Oh yeah, they were treated differently, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they weren't. As one of my friends on Facebook, who is a veteran protester, said, he's never seen people resolve, or he's never seen a protest devolve into looting or violence unless those protesters were pressed hard by the police. So I will certainly grant that the protesters in Minneapolis were treated differently than the protesters in Michigan, but the interplay between law enforcement and the protesters led to an overall very different situation, which makes it almost impossible now to draw legitimate comparisons between the two, or at the very least, to make the case that that the police response to Minneapolis would never have happened had the Michigan protesters turned violent, right? That's the problem. Now you have the situation where one of the protests did devolve into property damage, and we don't know it would have happened if the Michigan protest had resulted in some property damage. And as a result, now, you can have memes that are like, police come out, Blue Lives Matter, police put their lives on the line in one case, and then in the other case, oh, but it's perfectly peaceful and nobody got hurt. Well, actually, let me clarify. It doesn't look like anybody got hurt in Minneapolis. It was just property damage. And we went over this, so I'm not going to rehash it all. But, that's a key problem with the optics of what ended up happening. Humphrey Tsui. This is going to be a see more, so I'm going to click that. I agree with the comments and what you have said. To an unaffected outsider, the violence, the looting, and the condoning of such acts really makes one not feel sympathetic. Even though in principle I agree with the anger, the looting makes me think about what really is their motive here. Yes, exactly. And so the folks, and I want to say this again, there was a peaceful protest of thousands where George Floyd was killed, which had no interaction with the police, that was completely peaceful. A smaller contingent of that larger protest went to the police precinct, and those folks were also peaceful. A smaller contingent yet decided to vandalize the police station by breaking a window and spray painting police cars. And then the police came out, there was tear gas fired, and that altercation, well, one cannot say definitively what caused people to start looting, what caused people to start destroying property, but it was precipitated by a physical response from the police. And so, as my friend mentioned, he's not seen a protest evolve into looting or any sort of dangerous situation unless the police went hard on the protesters. And so I think, I said it yesterday, when the protesters approached the precinct, that would have been the moment for a brave and intelligent police chief or precinct chief to come out and address the protesters and commiserate with them over the loss of life and express the sadness and the need for everybody to work together in the criminal justice system to ensure that there is a fair trial and investigation of what happened. That's not what happened. The police came out with riot gear and tear gas, which, of course, amps up tensions and makes people feel like the police do not care about what happened and that they're just protecting their own. Now, whether that's right or wrong, it's this sort of escalation that leads people to then escalate on their own. There were a chance of you shoot us, we shoot back. Apparently, that's what reports are saying. This is one of the chants that was being done by protesters in Minneapolis. That's not the place where we want to be. But when people feel threatened, they are liable to act violently and defensively if they're physically threatened, right? So we do not want that sort of response from the police. We certainly don't want that sort of behavior from protesters. But at this point, I don't actually think that you can compare what's going on in Minneapolis to what's going on in Michigan. And that sucks because peaceful protests really have an important place in our society. And the fact that the police would respond in such a way is disheartening. And the fact that people would respond to that in the way they did is even more disheartening because it really breaks down the narrative that peaceful protest is even possible in some communities. And it starts to build a barrier between those people who see a peaceful protest of white folks with guns and protest that devolves into property damage with unarmed, in an unarmed black community, and it starts to set up those divisions in their minds or reinforce those divisions in their minds, and it's just so, I think it's just so counterproductive. It's really unfortunate. James Morris King with some more definitions from his previous post. ANCAPs, anarcho-capitalists. Yeah. On the other end of the scale, from Stalinist, on the other end. So ANCAPs equals anarcho-capitalists, who are on the other end of the scale from the Stalinist communists. Those hyper-libertarians who think government needs to be torn down because it restricts human freedom and market balancing. Some of them basically think the same way the Stalinists do about violence. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of violent folks out there. Deidre Levy, James Morris King, what's the difference between ANCAPs and Antifa? Anarcho-capitalists are like libertarians, and Antifa are anti-fascists. So anarcho-capitalists are like, there should be no restrictions on economic activity that people undertake, and we should fight the government with guns because that's our right to eliminate their capacity to regulate commerce. That's anarcho-capitalism. Antifa, or anti-fascists, are folks who believe that we have a fascist movement in the United States, and fascists should not be allowed any space in a democracy, and maybe some of them at least are willing to use violence to silence fascist speech. Julian Ballantyne, but are bringing guns to a Capitol building peaceful? It's certainly, I think it's threatening. I did a whole thing we did a whole live on that when the matter came up. Is it peaceful or is it violent? Well, that really depends on how you want to define peace and violence. So there's like negative peace and positive peace, and a positive peace is is one in which I'm not even going to get into the definitions of negative and positive peace because I'm not an expert on this, and so I don't want to misstate. But the general gist is that you can have a situation where there's tension, and the creation of that tension is viewed as violent. So that would say that the people who went to the Capitol with guns undertook a violent act because it disrupted other peaceful activities. Then there's the idea that violence means physical assault. And in that regard, the protests in Michigan were not violent because nobody got hurt. So that, it depends on how you want to define violence or where you draw the line. But for my part, the protests in Michigan were absolutely terrorism. Whether or not you want to say there was violence because nobody got hurt, they disrupted democratic functioning. Duly elected officials were incapable of representing their constituents because people showed up with guns, and that was absolutely a threat of violence. Whether or not people want to define that as violence, that's up to them. But it was 100% terrorism. So yeah, that would be my position on that. Julian Ballantyne, you called it terrorism, if I'm not mistaken. I did, and I stand by that, because they used the threat of force to disrupt peaceful association, to deprive American citizens of their right to representation, and to prevent an elected government from doing its job. If that ain't the definition of terrorism, I don't know what is. I guess that, there's maybe people out there who think that terrorism means Islam, but that is not what terrorism is. Terrorism is the threat of violence or the use of violence to achieve political objectives, and that is absolutely what happened in Michigan. Okay, we're already an hour into this, and I'm debating whether or not to do the rent bill, and I'm thinking we'll save it for tomorrow, and we'll talk about the rent relief package that's working its way through Albany and why it's absolute trash in tomorrow's live. Julian Ballantyne, is terrorism not violence? If you look up the definition of terrorism, you'll see that it's the use of violence or the threat of violence. So again, it really depends on how you define violence. Is it violent to create tension or to harm people through actions? Then one could say it's violent. But I think the more popular understanding of violence is physical assault, which is to say you have to physically hurt somebody. Like, are words violence? Like if you insult somebody and it hurts them physically, or if you insult somebody and it causes them to hurt themselves physically. If you insult somebody and it hurts them emotionally, is that violence? Even if you insult somebody that causes them to hurt themselves physically, does that count as violence? You know, there are the problem with expansive terms like denoting everything as violent means that, you know, it's just like this problem that we now have where everything is abuse. Not everything is abuse. Some people, you know, sometimes people are just shitty, and, you know, there are interactions between humans which are unpleasant. There's a book about this, and it's like cutting edge sociology stuff, right? Not everything's abuse, but prior to that, it was cutting edge to say everything's abuse, right? So I, for one, do not like expansive terms. Expansive terms simply lead to ambiguities over what something is. For me, violence is physical assault. There are other things which are bad. There is, you know, the threat of violence. There is terrorism. You know, I like to use the word that properly conveys what I'm trying to say. Because if I just call everything violence, then the next time somebody, you know, says something on Twitter that hurts my feelings, then that's violence. But now the word violence loses all meaning. Now when you report violence somewhere, it degrades the impact of something being violent. So for me personally, I like to have very rigid definitions when like in speech or when conveying ideas, because otherwise there's too much room for ambiguity. And when you have ambiguity, it lessens the capacity to convey meaning, right? If everything is violent, then nothing is violent. If everyone's special, then no one's special. I mean, go watch The Edibles. Maybe syndrome is right. Maybe syndrome is wrong. If everybody's special, can people still be special? They can be unique, maybe. Anyway, let's now we can talk about The Incredibles tomorrow. Deidre Levy, New York Times, politics, Trump, Jack Dorsey. So this is something about Twitter, but I don't get the link previews when people post the links in the chat while I'm live. So it's something about Donald Trump and Twitter. That's all I can say. In any event, please join tomorrow at 8:30 for another 8:30 Live. We will absolutely be discussing the rent relief package, which is working its way through Albany, which is absolute trash. And everybody should know why it's trash. And everybody should know what the government is doing to help landlords and maybe kind of help tenants and renters. All right. See you all tomorrow at 8:30.